Listen to me carefully, because what I'm about to tell you will strip away every comfortable lie you've been fed about human nature, about society, about the very foundations of the world you think you understand. Thomas Hobbes knew something that most people today refuse to acknowledge, that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, beneath the polite smiles and social contracts, lies the raw, unfiltered truth of what we really are. We are not noble savages corrupted by society. We are not inherently good beings, twisted by circumstance. We are creatures driven by fear, desire, and the relentless pursuit of power, and until you accept this fundamental reality, you will remain weak, manipulated, and at the mercy of those who understand the game better than you do. Hobbes called it the state of nature, that original condition where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But here's what he understood that you need to grasp right now. We never truly left that state. We simply learned to dress it up, to create elaborate systems and structures that mask the underlying struggle for dominance that defines every human interaction. The boardroom, the classroom, the family dinner table, these are all battlegrounds where the same ancient dynamics play out, where the strong impose their will upon the weak, where fear and desire drive every decision, every relationship, every moment of your existence. You think you live in a civilized world, but civilization is nothing more than organized violence. The government, the corporations, the institutions you trust, they all derive their power from the same source that Hobbes identified centuries ago, the ability to inspire fear and the promise to satisfy desire. They understand what you refuse to see, that human beings are not motivated by abstract principles or moral ideals, but by the most basic emotions that have driven us since we first crawled out of caves and learned to make fire. Fear of death, fear of pain, fear of being alone, fear of being powerless. These are the strings that move every puppet in this grand theater we call society. But here's where most people get it wrong. They hear this truth and they despair. They think it means we're doomed to chaos, to endless conflict, to a world where might makes right and the weak suffer what they must. That's not what Hobbes taught, and it's not what I'm teaching you. What Hobbes understood, what you need to understand, is that recognizing this reality is the first step toward transcending it, not by denying human nature, not by pretending we're something we're not, but by accepting what we are and learning to work with it, to channel it, to use it as the foundation for something greater. The Leviathan, that great artificial creature that Hobbes described as the ideal state, wasn't born from naive optimism about human goodness. It was born from brutal realism about human nature. It was the recognition that if you want peace, you must prepare for war. If you want order, you must first master chaos. If you want to build something lasting, you must first understand the forces that seek to tear it down. The Leviathan succeeds not because it changes human nature, but because it works with human nature, channeling our darkest impulses toward constructive ends. And this is your first lesson in real power. The power that comes not from wishful thinking or moral posturing, but from clear-eyed understanding of how the world actually works. Power is not something you take, it's something you create. It's not something you demand, it's something you build. And it's not built on the foundation of what people say they want or what they claim to believe, but on the bedrock of what actually motivates them, what actually drives them, what actually keeps them awake at night and gets them up in the morning. Fear is the most powerful force in human psychology, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or fooling themselves. But fear is not your enemy, it's your tool. The person who understands fear, who can read it in others and master it in themselves, holds the key to every door in this world. Not the crude fear of the bully or the tyrant, but the sophisticated fear that comes from understanding consequences, from recognizing stakes, from knowing what people have to lose. This is the fear that makes people listen when you speak, that makes them consider your words carefully, that makes them think twice before crossing you or ignoring your interests. But fear alone is not enough, because fear without direction becomes panic, and panic serves no one. This is where desire comes in, the other great driver of human behavior. People don't just move away from what they fear, they move toward what they want. And the person who can position themselves as the gateway to what others desire, who can become the bridge between where people are and where they want to be, that person holds power that no law can grant and no force can take away. Think about every great leader in history, every person who shaped the world according to their vision. They didn't succeed because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most moral. They succeeded because they understood these fundamental dynamics of human nature. They knew how to inspire the right kind of fear, not the fear that paralyzes, but the fear that motivates. They knew how to channel desire, not by promising easy satisfaction, but by showing people a path to something greater than themselves. Look at how the modern world works, really works, beneath all the democratic rhetoric and corporate mission statements. The most successful companies don't succeed because they make the best products. They succeed because they understand desire better than their competitors. They don't just sell you what you need, they sell you what you want, what you fear losing, what you believe will make you more than you are. The most effective politicians don't win because they have the best policies. They win because they understand fear better than their opponents. They don't just promise to solve problems. They promise to protect you from threats, to save you from consequences, to stand between you and the chaos that always lurks just beneath the surface of civilized life. And this brings us to a crucial understanding. Power is not about domination for its own sake. That's the mistake of petty tyrants and schoolyard bullies. Real power, the kind that builds empires and changes worlds, is about creating order out of chaos. It's about providing structure where there was confusion, certainty where there was doubt, direction where there was drift. The person who can do this, who can take the raw fear and desire that drives human behavior and channel it toward productive ends, that person becomes indispensable. But here's what separates the truly powerful from the merely ambitious. They understand that this power must be earned, not just seized. You can't fake understanding of human nature. You can't pretend a mastery you don't possess. People might not be able to articulate what they sense in you, but they can feel whether you truly grasp the forces that move them, whether you really understand what they fear and what they want. This is why authentic power has a quality that borrowed power never does. It resonates at a frequency that touches something deep in the human psyche, something that recognizes genuine authority when it encounters it. The social contract that Hobbes described, that agreement by which individuals surrender some of their natural freedom in exchange for protection and order, is not some abstract philosophical concept. It's a transaction that happens every day, in every relationship, in every organization, in every society. People are constantly deciding who they will trust with power over their lives, who they will follow, who they will obey. And they make these decisions not based on credentials, or titles or legal authority, but based on their assessment of who can actually deliver what they promise, who can actually protect what needs protecting, who can actually navigate the complexities of human nature that everyone else pretends don't exist. This is why so many people who should have power don't, and why so many people who seem unqualified somehow end up in positions of influence. The credentials and qualifications that look good on paper often have little to do with the actual ability to understand and work with human nature. The person with the advanced degrees might be completely lost when it comes to reading the room, understanding what people really want, or knowing how to motivate them toward a common goal. Meanwhile, the person who never went to college but has spent years watching people, learning their patterns, understanding their motivations, that person might possess the kind of practical wisdom that no amount of formal education can provide. But understanding human nature is only the beginning. The next step is learning to apply this understanding strategically, to think several moves ahead, to anticipate how people will respond to different approaches, different incentives, different pressures. This is where the art of power becomes truly sophisticated, not just knowing what motivates people, but knowing how to arrange circumstances so that their motivations align with your objectives. Consider how a master chess player thinks about the game. They don't just see the current position of the pieces. They see the potential positions, several moves in advance. They understand not just what they want to accomplish, but what their opponent wants to accomplish. They know that every move creates new possibilities and forecloses others, that every decision shapes the landscape of future decisions. This is exactly how you must learn to think about human relationships, about organizational dynamics, about the complex web of interests and motivations that shape every situation you encounter. The person who masters this kind of strategic thinking develops what we might call social intelligence, the ability to read the currents beneath the surface of any interaction, to understand not just what people are saying, but what they mean, not just what they claim to want, but what they actually need, not just what they do, but why they do it. This intelligence cannot be learned from books alone, though books can certainly help. It must be developed through careful observation, through trial and error, through the patient accumulation of experience in dealing with people under various circumstances and pressures. And here's something crucial that most people never grasp. This kind of intelligence is not about manipulation in the crude sense. It's not about tricking people or deceiving them or getting them to act against their own interests. That's the approach of amateurs, and it never works in the long run because it violates the fundamental principle of sustainable power, that real power must serve not just your interests, but the interests of those who grant it to you. The person who tries to build power on deception and manipulation inevitably destroys themselves, because deception requires enormous energy to maintain, and manipulation creates enemies who will eventually find ways to strike back. No, real power is about alignment, about finding ways to make what you want compatible with what others want, about creating situations where serving your interests also serves their interests, about building structures where everyone benefits from your success. This is infinitely more difficult than simple manipulation, but it's also infinitely more sustainable. The power built on mutual benefit can last for generations, while the power built on deception collapses the moment people see through the facade. This brings us to one of the most important insights about power, that it's not a zero-sum game. The crude understanding of power assumes that for me to have more, you must have less. But sophisticated power creates value, it expands possibilities, it makes everyone better off, even while concentrating authority in particular hands. The great leaders throughout history understood this principle. They didn't just take power from others, they created new forms of power that hadn't existed before. Think about the entrepreneurs who built the great companies of the modern world. They didn't succeed by taking market share from existing competitors. They succeeded by creating entirely new markets, by making things possible that people hadn't even imagined before. They understood that the greatest power comes not from redistributing existing resources, but from creating new resources, new possibilities, new forms of value that benefit everyone involved. But creating this kind of power requires something that most people lack: the willingness to take responsibility, not just for your own actions, but for the consequences of those actions on everyone around you. This is perhaps the heaviest burden of real power, and it's why so many people who could have power choose not to pursue it. It's easier to be a follower, to let others make the difficult decisions, to avoid the weight of responsibility that comes with true authority. The person who accepts this responsibility, who willingly takes on the burden of thinking not just about their own interests, but about the interests of everyone affected by their decisions, that person develops a kind of moral authority that transcends legal or institutional power. People sense when someone is genuinely thinking about their welfare, when someone is making decisions from a place of genuine concern for the common good, rather than pure self-interest. This sensing creates a loyalty that no amount of money can buy and no threat can coerce. But here's where we must be brutally honest about what this responsibility actually entails. It's not about being nice or accommodating or trying to make everyone happy. That's impossible, and the attempt to do it leads to paralysis and ineffectiveness. Real responsibility means making hard choices, often choices that some people won't like, often choices that require short-term sacrifice for long-term benefit. It means being willing to be misunderstood, to be criticized, to be blamed for outcomes that were beyond your control. The person who can't handle this kind of pressure, who needs constant approval and validation, who can't make decisions that might anger some people, that person will never possess real power, no matter what titles they hold or positions they occupy. Real power requires the ability to act decisively, even when the information is incomplete, even when the stakes are high, even when you know that some people will be hurt by your decisions. This is not cruelty. It's the recognition that in a world of limited resources and competing interests, every choice involves trade-offs, and the person in power must be willing to make those trade-offs consciously and deliberately, rather than letting them happen by default. This capacity for decisive action in the face of uncertainty is perhaps the most important quality that separates leaders from followers. Anyone can make decisions when the path is clear and the outcome is certain. But the moments that define leadership are those moments when the way forward is unclear, when the risks are high, when different advisors are giving conflicting counsel, when delay might be fatal, but action might be disastrous. In these moments, the person with real power must be able to cut through the noise, to trust their understanding of human nature and their assessment of the situation, to act with conviction even while acknowledging the possibility of error. And when you do act, when you make those hard choices that leadership requires, you must be prepared for the consequences. Not just the intended consequences, but the unintended ones as well. Every decision creates ripple effects that extend far beyond what you can predict or control. The person who exercises power must be prepared to live with these consequences, to accept responsibility for outcomes they didn't intend, to adapt their approach based on results they didn't anticipate. This is why power is so lonely, not because powerful people are isolated by their position, but because they must often make decisions that others can't understand. Decisions that require them to see patterns and possibilities that others miss. Decisions that sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term benefit. The person who truly understands power knows that it often requires you to be the villain in someone else's story, to be misunderstood by people whose approval you might want, to choose the path that serves the greater good, even when that path is painful or unpopular. But this loneliness is also the source of power's greatest satisfaction. The satisfaction that comes from seeing your vision become reality, from watching the structures you build outlast your own involvement in them, from knowing that your decisions have created possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. This is the reward that makes all the sacrifice worthwhile, not the reward of wealth or status or recognition, though these might come as well, but the deeper reward of knowing that you have genuinely contributed something meaningful to the world. The tragedy of most people's lives is that they never even attempt to exercise this kind of power. They settle for the illusion of safety that comes from avoiding responsibility, from letting others make the hard choices, from following rather than leading. But this safety is itself an illusion, because in a world where power exists whether you acknowledge it or not, the person who refuses to develop their own power simply becomes subject to the power of others. You can't opt out of the game. You can only choose whether to play it consciously and skillfully, or to let it play you. And the game is always being played whether you realize it or not. Every interaction you have, every relationship you form, every organization you join, these are all contexts where power dynamics are constantly shifting, where influence is being gained and lost, where the future is being shaped by the decisions of people who understand these dynamics better than you do. The person who remains unconscious of these dynamics, who pretends they don't exist or that they're somehow above such concerns, inevitably finds themselves manipulated by those who have no such illusions. This is why developing your understanding of power is not optional. It's a necessity for anyone who wants to live a life of genuine autonomy and effectiveness. You need to understand how power works, not so you can abuse it, but so you can recognize when it's being used against you, so you can build your own sources of influence and authority, so you can shape your own circumstances rather than simply reacting to circumstances shaped by others. The development of this understanding begins with brutal honesty about your own motivations, your own fears, your own desires. You cannot understand others until you understand yourself, and you cannot work effectively with human nature until you have come to terms with your own nature. This means acknowledging the parts of yourself that you might prefer to deny, the parts that are selfish, that are afraid, that want things you're not supposed to want, that are capable of actions you're not supposed to contemplate. This self-knowledge is not comfortable, but it's absolutely essential. The person who maintains illusions about their own purity or nobility is easily manipulated by others who understand their hidden motivations better than they do themselves. The person who acknowledges their own capacity for selfishness and fear is much harder to manipulate, because they can recognize when others are appealing to these same motivations, when they're being offered something that seems too good to be true, when they're being asked to act against their own long-term interests for someone else's short-term benefit. Once you have this foundation of self-knowledge, you can begin to develop the same kind of clear-eyed understanding of others. You can start to see past the facades that people present to the world, to understand the fears and desires that actually drive their behavior, to predict how they will respond to different situations and different kinds of pressure. This understanding doesn't make you cynical. It makes you realistic. It doesn't make you manipulative. It makes you effective. And effectiveness is what power is ultimately about. The ability to get things done, to make things happen, to turn vision into reality. The person who understands human nature, but can't apply that understanding to achieve concrete results, hasn't really mastered power at all. They've simply become a sophisticated observer of a game they're not actually playing. Real power must be demonstrated through results, through the ability to influence outcomes, through the capacity to build something that lasts. These results don't have to be grand or world-changing. They can be as simple as building a team that works well together, creating a family environment where everyone feels valued and secure, or developing a business that serves both your interests and the interests of your customers. The scale doesn't matter as much as the principle of understanding what motivates people and using that understanding to create outcomes that serve everyone involved. But as you develop this capacity, as you begin to see results from applying these principles, you must guard against the corruption that often accompanies power. The person who successfully influences others, who gets things done, who builds effective organizations, that person can easily begin to believe that their success gives them the right to ignore the interests of others, to use people as mere tools for their own advancement, to take shortcuts that sacrifice long-term sustainability for short-term gain. This corruption is not inevitable, but it's always a risk, and it's a risk that increases with success. The person who never develops any real power is never really tested by the temptations that power brings. But the person who does develop genuine influence and authority must constantly choose between the easy path of exploitation and the harder path of genuine service. This choice must be made over and over again, in small decisions as well as large ones, because the habits of power are formed through countless individual choices about how to treat others, how to make decisions, how to balance competing interests. The person who consistently chooses the path of service, who uses their power to create value rather than simply extract it, develops a different kind of authority, an authority based not just on fear or desire, but on genuine respect and trust. This is the highest form of power, the kind that creates lasting change, the kind that builds institutions and movements that outlast their founders. It's also the hardest kind of power to develop, because it requires constant vigilance against the temptations of selfishness and the corrupting influence of success. But for those who can maintain this discipline, who can develop and exercise power without losing sight of its proper purpose, the rewards extend far beyond personal satisfaction. They become forces for genuine progress in the world, catalysts for positive change, builders of structures that make life better for everyone involved. They discover that the highest exercise of power is not the domination of others, but the creation of conditions where others can exercise their own power more effectively. This is the true lesson of Thomas Hobbes, not that we must submit to leviathans who rule through fear and force, but that we must become the kind of people who can build and sustain the institutions that channel human nature toward constructive ends. We must develop the understanding, the skills, and the character necessary to exercise power responsibly, to create order without destroying freedom, to provide security without stifling growth, to lead without becoming tyrants. The world needs people who understand these principles, who can apply them skillfully and ethically, who can build bridges between competing interests and create solutions that serve the common good while respecting individual autonomy. The world needs people who are not afraid of power, but who understand its proper use, who can handle its burdens without being corrupted by its temptations. The question is whether you will be one of these people, whether you will develop the understanding and the character necessary to exercise real power in service of something greater than yourself, whether you will take on the responsibility that comes with genuine authority, or whether you will remain a passive observer of a game that others are playing all around you. The choice is yours, but the choice is not optional. In a world where power exists, you must either develop your own or remain subject to the power of others. There is no neutral ground, no safe harbor where you can avoid these dynamics altogether. So choose consciously, choose to understand, choose to develop yourself, choose to take responsibility, choose to use whatever power you develop in service of something worthy of the effort and sacrifice it requires. The world is waiting for people who can handle power without being corrupted by it, who can lead without becoming tyrants, who can create order without destroying the very things that make life worth living. The world is waiting for you to become the person you have the capacity to become.